This is Counsel Cast, part of the Legal Talk Network, and I'm your host, Karin Conroy. When you face a complex case outside your expertise, you bring in a co-counsel for next-level results. When you want to engage, expand, and elevate your firm, you bring in a marketing co-counsel. In this podcast, I bring in marketing experts who each answer one big question to help your firm achieve more. Here's today's guest.
Hi, my name is Angelo Ponzi, and I'm a Fractional Chief Marketing Officer. My company's called Kraft, and where I focus is on strategy, on the strategic side of marketing. So what does that mean? I use market research to help companies better understand the market in which they're competing in, understanding their customers, their prospects, their competition, and using that information to build messaging and positioning strategies. And then ultimately, where do you want to be in 3 to 5 years? And I would develop plans to help you get there. If you notice, I've only talked about strategy and planning and positioning. I've not mentioned tactics. Well, as a fractional chief marketing officer, yes, I do get involved in all of those, but I believe that you don't deal with tactics until you have all the strategic work done.
Oh my gosh, I feel like that was a great introduction, Angelo. Thank you for being here. Let's start with that before I forget to say that, because I feel like there was a lot of all the details that you said that we're going to dig into and kind of explain in further detail. So that was the title for today's show is How Can a Fractional CMO Transform Your Law Firm's Marketing? So first, I know you and I both get this question all the time. We have a fractional CMO program that's called Marketing Co-Counsel. And the first question most people say is, what is that? What is a fractional CMO? And I know this fractional thing is all over the place. You see it in all the industries, CEO, CMO, CFO. I've seen CTOs, but basically every version of a department within a company now has these fractional people like myself and yourself out there who are offering our expert level services on a fractional basis. I used to be a director of marketing at a major company, and I know what that looks like from the inside. Then I began my business, and I've had pieces of that throughout where I insert my expertise and my experience with all my client engagement. But now this is very specifically driven to be that sort of role for these law firms. So, Angelo, let's start first with what is a fractional CMO?
So real simply, if you think about time, our time in a given week, we're selling pieces or fractions of our time to companies, to law firms, for example.
Yeah.
So a company will come in and say, I want 8 hours of your time per week. Again, they don't start off that way, right? We have to give them a plan, but basically they're going to buy 8 hours of our time per week. So 32 hours a month. Then we come in and we do a lot of strategic work and planning and messaging and positioning, all the things I talked about.
Yeah.
And that's really simply it. We used to call it outsourcing and contract work, but typically those engagements tended to be a little more interim in nature, which just means you've actually taken the role over for a period of time versus getting a fraction of your time in a given week, month, whatever it happens to be.
Yeah. We're going to come back to the idea of the pay for time versus how the budgets are set up. And we're going to get to that a little bit later. But first, we want to cover more like, what is it? How does it work? So let's talk about how it relates to when someone hires you or I know you talked a lot about in your intro about strategy. So this is where we start. It sounds like this is where you start. And how does that work for you guys? And why do you start with the strategy and how does that work?
Yeah, ultimately, when someone comes and said, hey, we need a new website, a social media program, PPC, and my answer is great, but who's your customer? What motivates them? What are their behaviors? What do I need to do with all that tactical stuff? And that translates to, well, we need to dig into the market, into your competition, understand, looking for opportunities, looking for gaps in the market, in your messaging, your positioning. Do you need to reposition? And by starting there, you have a really clear picture on what you need to accomplish when you get into the executional side. And that's where we look at what is in that strategy standpoint and how we're going to position you in the marketplace to differentiate yourself from the competition, to be relevant to your customers, and without being relevant, and we're just throwing a lot of stuff at the wall and hoping that it sticks.
Exactly. And while you were talking, I was thinking about kind of how our process works. And typically, we're working with either a firm whose marketing's not working or a firm who's setting up a new firm, and so they're starting from scratch. And in the first case where they're coming to us and it's not working, it's almost always a problem of strategy. So they started from those tactics and the tactic driven idea. Usually it's something along the lines of, and hopefully this rings true and sounds familiar to some of you. Somebody like a partner went to a conference and they're sitting next to a guy, and the guy says, "Hey, have you heard of XYZ?" And the partner's like, "We got to do XYZ." Whatever it is, Twitter, TikTok, usually it's some like flash in the pan concept. Sometimes it's like, "Oh my gosh, we're not doing Google ads." But there's no reason behind other than FOMO, like this fear of missing out. And the guy over there who seems like he's got a big, nice firm and looks like maybe he's making some good money, he says, and it's like, this is not a strategy. FOMO is not your strategy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I like to say hope is not a strategy,
Yeah. Right. Crossing
nor
your fingers.
is the field of dreams syndrome,
Right.
which is build it
Oh
and
my
they will
gosh.
come. And I think that that's like the chasing shining objects, right? Somebody
Yes.
says, "Hey, have you done this?" "Oh, I got to go do that, and you got to go do this." But it may not necessarily be right. I mean, I deal with clients, they go, "Oh, we want to be on Instagram, TikTok." And it's like, you're a
Why?
manufacturing company. Nobody
Right.
on TikTok is going to
Yes.
buy your services. So,
Yeah.
let's look at where the best place to invest. I have dealt with a few law firms. I can't say that's my specialty,
Yeah.
but the principles of marketing and strategy and execution and understanding apply everywhere. It's really understanding if you're an immigration law firm or if you're a transactional, if you're business or whatever it happens to be, you have to understand who your targets are,
Yeah.
what motivates them, what changes their behaviors, why would they come to someone like you? And this might not be PC with your audience, but I mean, I can throw a rock and hit a whole bunch of lawyers at one time, right? So
Absolutely.
how do you differentiate yourself from all the other packs? I belong to
Right.
some networking groups that have a high concentration of lawyers. Sometimes they're sitting in a meeting and there's 15 lawyers,
Yes.
all slightly different, and they're really working hard to position themselves differently. They
Right.
might all offer the same services, but at the end of the day, how do I position myself differently within that group so someone says, "I remember him because of."
Because he said this one unique thing. And so I was thinking about the before and after of a firm who has come to us and they say, our marketing doesn't work. And one of the partners, he just doesn't believe in marketing as though it's some sort of a faith-based institution or something, Typically, how that looks. Actually, I'm going to have you explain, and I can step in and give some examples too, but where we usually start, what their messaging and positioning might look like versus what happens when we step in and kind of notice what might be missing and sort of resolve that and adjust that. What does that look like for you guys when you're usually working with whoever you're?
Well, I think the biggest thing where companies make a mistake, and it's hard for them to hear,
Yeah.
is they talk to themselves. Sitting in the boardroom or a conference room with 10 lawyers, the senior lawyers sitting around talking about how they want to market.
Where they went to law school.
Yeah, they're
Nobody
not buying
cares.
their own services.
Yeah.
And so that's why I always say you got to get outside of that. When I don't care what the organization is, you got to get outside from talking to yourselves.
Yep.
I tell clients sometimes, say in the manufacturing side, it's like, how many of these $1 million wafer steppers are you going to buy this year? You're not going to buy any. You sell them. So
Yes.
quit talking to yourselves about how to do that. A lot of case studies about mistakes that have been made. And I think once they do that and get out of just talking to themselves, get out there, talk to people that have hired them. Why did
Yeah.
you hire us?
Yeah.
What separated us? You didn't just pick us off a Google search. You talked to other companies or other firms. Why did you pick us? Just by understanding that can help create messaging and positioning and all
Yes.
that good
Yeah.
stuff.
Well, and first take a look at your website. Who are you talking to, like you were saying? And what are you saying on your website? I can't tell you the number of times, and it's not just your website. It's, but I'm just going to keep coming back to the website because it's the easiest, most obvious thing to start with. But I can't tell you the number of times I'm talking to, someone who's contacted me and I pull up their site and I'm like, why does it say this? Why does it say I do, divorce lawyer in Pennsylvania? Like, what, who cares? That is not saying anything about you that I couldn't already have probably figured out before I even clicked on your site. When I did a Google search for divorce lawyer in Pennsylvania, I already knew you were going to be a divorce lawyer in Pennsylvania. So let's say something better and more compelling. And here's the reason I believe most of them are saying kind of things that we're laughing about right now is that's not easy. Like it's not the easy answer. The easy answer takes work and effort, and you have to pare it down, and you probably have a lot of things to say that you have to figure out how to simplify and make very compelling. But it looks, once it clicks and it's right, it does kind of look easy, but it's not.
Well, I think, and I'm glad you're picking on websites. I believe it's like the calling card these days.
Yeah.
People are going to go to Google, they're going to search, and number one, you better show up. Because
Yeah.
if you do, they're going to go to your website. They're not going to
Right.
call you first. They're not going to look at your business card, right? They're going to go to see what clients you might have, or can they know somebody they can call and talk
Yep.
about you, right? So referral partners
Even
are
if
going to
they
be
already have
extremely
your name,
important.
even if someone has given you their name, they're going to Google you for sure to see, just to get some kind of impression.
Correct. And the other thing too is a lot of companies and law firms, they talk about the firm in a sense, right?
Yeah.
Here's where we went to school, how many years we've been in business. But at the end of the day, what are you going to do for me? And
Yes.
so that gets back to that relevancy and kind of a customer centric, if you will, client centric conversation. If I come to you and I need a divorce lawyer, or
Yeah.
I need an immigration lawyer, or business transaction or contracts, I want to know why it's going to be important to me and be relevant to me, not necessarily that
Right.
explain it in a little different format to hook me in, because ultimately that becomes very rational in conversation versus
Yeah.
making an emotional connection. If you're talking about a divorce lawyer, there's already emotion connected. How
Right.
can you relate to me emotionally to
Yeah.
say they get me before I even make a phone call,
Yeah.
versus, okay, I got 15 lawyers, they're all saying the same thing, how do I pick one?
Okay, so this is a very tiny nutshell of an idea of how strategy sort of works. Obviously, it's much more complex.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot more time and effort that's going to go into the details, and it's clearly going to be customized and specific to your firm. So, example may not apply, but this is just an example. So let's talk about, okay, we've put this strategy together. We put a bunch of time and effort into figuring out who that client is, what the rough idea of the message is, and how we're going to approach all of the marketing. And that's strategy. So then, first of all, how do you choose the various elements that are going to be done next? So we're assuming there's going to probably be some website, either creation or updates. And then what else? How do you figure that what else part?
Part of it is looking at who I'm competing against. If you've got 5 firms you're competing against and every one of them is blogging,
Yep.
I'm gonna say I think blogging is probably something we need to do. We're gonna analyze what their messages and stories are, break
Hmm.
those down, and then really kind of benchmarking that set. And then I frankly just go on and type in jokingly divorce lawyers near me, right? And
Yeah.
see who pops up and what are they saying and what are those keywords. And so really deep dive into what your competitive firms are doing
Yeah.
and analyzing that. And that's going to lead you to, do I need to be on TikTok? No, nobody else is that really an opportunity? Maybe,
Yeah.
maybe,
Yeah.
but would I invest my money there first? Probably not. And I think part of it is about being ever present. To your point way earlier, I can't remember if we are talking pre-show or not, but it's about being in the community and having
Yeah.
people know who you are. And every time you walk out that door, I mean, you're not only dealing with your personal brand, but your personal brand is being reflective of your company, of your firm, and you need to make sure you're out there. And that's whether it's networking groups or giving presentations and speaking, you're doing webinars and seminars. I mean, you're really putting yourself up there as a thought leader, if you will, and that translates back.
We did talk about this a little bit before we started recording, just this definition of what is marketing in general, because what you're talking about, I think a lot of firms initially talk to me about not thinking that that's really marketing. So one of the big things that people say to me in our first calls is, well, we don't ever do marketing because all of our leads come through referrals. Our marketing plan is to hire a bunch of attorneys and have them bring in a book of business. And they don't even really see that as marketing, which it is. So let's just start by saying referrals and the way that you've got your firm set up to receive referrals, you've done something there that would qualify under the textbook definition of marketing. So let's add that into your plan. And then let's work accordingly around that to either support it, encourage it, make it better, have systems or something along those lines. So let's talk about what other pieces, like you were just talking about actually physically going out and networking. Yes, that's marketing. Absolutely. What other pieces do people not think about in terms of them being marketing that you should consider when you're thinking of your whole plan?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is looking at. So I'm a big believer in integrated marketing,
Yeah,
and so there isn't a silver bullet in our business.
right.
And so you have to look at that. What's that integration? Where are people turning to? They're turning to referral. So who are some of your referral partners? It could be
Yeah,
CPAs, those kinds of things. So from a marketing standpoint, you want to really build that referral network and making sure they understand what your firm offers.
hmm,
And so that in itself is a big effort. Not only deal with the people that you do know, but how do you drop that rock in the pond and watch the ripples go out? Because
yeah,
ultimately, you want to continue to expand that network. And
yes,
so for me, that's a huge one, again, depending on the industry segment, but that generates lots of opportunities. And
yeah,
again, at the end of the day, if someone comes to you and says, "Hey, you met this Ponzi guy," yeah, I know him. The first thing they're going to do, they're going to go to my website or my LinkedIn.
yep,
I mean, that's where they're going. So you have to look at all these various tools, and in my case, LinkedIn is the number one. We do have Facebook, and we have all those other channels. But at the end of the day, it's LinkedIn that is where we really do the driving. And so you
yeah.
have to, again, where are people going to turn to? And I think that's an area that, from the referral network standpoint, and just getting out, and there's a gazillion networking groups out there, and be out there and participate.
Yeah, this is always part of our initial strategy discussion. And it feels sort of, I'm not sure what the word is I'm looking for, but it's basically a conversation where it's like, okay, what do you guys do? What works? And, we kind of go back and forth about, okay, do you do networking? Are you active on LinkedIn? And we kind of talk through all of the things that you're talking about because some of these things are sort of embedded in their heads and they're not really thinking about it because it's become so natural over however many years they've been working on. But it's so important to sit down and really spend some time thinking this through in terms of what is really working. And that's where the gold of your plan is. So let's figure out, like, where are those people? Where are your clients? And what do they listen to and care about? And then how do we build around that? Not just show up in TikTok and, like, hey, we're here. Let's show up intentionally based on the fact that we know that your potential clients really watch a lot of a certain kind of thing. So then we've got this idea. Let's say we've kind of sat down, figured out, okay, we've got these places that we know are working. It's our referral networks, it's maybe LinkedIn, and it's maybe some other networking thing. How do you then take that information and build a plan? And then how do you prioritize which things you do first and how do you make that plan out of it?
Sure. Well, part of it is, what's the budget?
Yeah.
And so there are kind of industry guidelines that are all over the place to kind of at least look at some benchmarks of where you should be from an investment standpoint. And then ultimately, once you have that, is, do you build a plan, a zero-based budget plan, and just put a bunch of stuff against it and then put a price tag, and then have the firm say, well, it's too expensive, and now you're juggling, but budget by objectives and what you're trying to accomplish. And so there's lots of different ways to approach the budgetary aspect of
Yeah.
what that cost.
Yeah.
And then ultimately looking at your key tactical elements, and then based on that budget, I look at how do we allocate those dollars and what we need to do, right? If we're blogging twice a month or blogging once a month or blogging 5 times a month, is that giving you a return on investment? And the one thing we haven't talked about is really tracking the access to data. A lot of my background is in research and analysis, and the data is there, and
Yep.
to spend the time analyzing. One of the law firms, most firms that I deal with, when they get a lead, they're all excited. And my question is, where'd you get it from? They go, oh,
Right.
I don't know. We didn't
Yeah.
ask. Well, can we
That I
ask?
feel like is critical failure if you are not tracking. And even if it doesn't have to be this super complicated thing, this should just absolutely be one of the first questions. Like, who can I thank? How did you find us? Some basic
Mhm.
thing. And usually, like, especially if you have an intake person and then a lawyer who may be talking to them, it's okay to ask that question more than once so that you know that you have it covered, because you want to just have even just this gut feeling about what's working, so that when I ask you that question, you don't look so like deer in the headlights. Like, you should have some sense without even really needing to look at the reports. Like, oh my gosh, everybody's talking about this certain blog post I wrote, and that just went crazy. And they all, when the first thing they say when I get on the call is, I read this thing that you wrote, and maybe it was I wrote it on some other site. I saw this thing that you wrote, or I saw this podcast you were on, or whatever. And oftentimes they'll mention it, but if they don't, you have to be tracking that. You just have to.
It's really critical because if you look at, and not to go all geeky, but if you talk about, attribution
Yeah.
models, what's the first touch, what's the last touch, and
Yep.
could be a whole lot of stuff in between. So you never really ultimately know, but they could say, well, I found you on the internet. So did you just go Google,
Yeah.
lawyers
Which
near
part of the
me?
internet? Can we narrow that down a little?
Well, and then you find out, well, actually Bob told me about you
Yeah.
guys and now on the internet. Well, they're only
And then
thinking
I went to the
internet, but
internet.
yeah. So by just trying to track that down and understand, I think over time you can start to get a pattern on
Yeah.
where your time, and it's money, but time is well spent in being out there and building the brand.
Yeah. And it's important because don't get distracted. You mentioned these shiny objects, but I think a lot of people come in with that shiny object thinking, this is top of my mind, so this must be the first thing that we address, even though it's very often the least likely thing to have any level of return or success or anything, because it's just sort of a trendy whatever that everybody's talking about. And speaking of that, two things that I want to talk about. You mentioned budgets, and I want to get back to that and talk about kind of how that works in a minute. But first, because we're talking about sort of trendy topics, I want to talk about AI for a moment. I know it's what everybody's talking about. So, just for a minute, let's talk about how you can kind of use the data that you have and your marketing, and how can AI be a part of this or be integrated with this, and where does AI fit into this whole idea?
If we're talking about, chat GPT and things like that, but it's understanding that there's, 4 or 5 or 6 that kind of bubble to the top. And
Yeah.
it's understanding how they deal with data. And some of these you can actually go in and say, don't share my data, my questions with the rest
Yeah.
of the world. Like
Yeah.
ChatGPT, I mean, it's open. So anything you go in and you search now becomes part of their database. But I think it's a good tool for ideation
Yes.
and to give you certain ideas and directions. I don't encourage people to write all their blogs with
No.
ChatGPT. As
Yeah.
funny story, about a year ago, I'm sitting in a meeting at a digital agency, actually out of San Diego.
Yeah.
Says, I just fired all my copywriters. We're doing everything
Oh.
on ChatGPT, and it was like, seriously?
Oh, and they think they're being really like forward thinking, but it's like I mentioned this a few times, and if anybody's listening to any of the last few episodes, the best explanation of how to sort of think of it that I got from Gert Mellick a few episodes ago is to think of it as an intern. So we're not gonna, have this use ChatGPT at like the partner level. We're not gonna do
Yeah.
this in high value, high stakes work. It's an intern. And as an intern, it's not even like the full time employee. So as an intern, I explain everything in very specific, clear detail. And then I would never take an intern's work and make it public with my name on it. So I am going to take everything, review it, put my own spin on it, but it's going to do intern level work for you. It's going to do it so fast and so, very good if you do it right and you keep it all within scope. So I love that explanation.
It's really about the prompts. I
Yes.
mean, there's a whole new world of prompt engineering. And so it's really about what you're asking and how you frame it is,
Yeah.
garbage in, garbage out. I won't get this exactly right, but the story of the lawyers that used it to write their cases and then took it to
Yes.
the judge and they got in a lot of trouble. If you don't double check it, I was working
That's
on
just dumb.
a project and I said, I need a case study that supports this point. And so I asked ChatGPT to find me a case study and it did. It was incredible. And then when I was reading, I'm going, this is BS. This
Yeah.
doesn't exist.
No.
So I can't use this. So,
Right.
fortunately, I didn't do anything with it. But
Yeah. Because it
yeah, so
will
it's
create
understand.
fake stuff like that.
Oh,
And so
yeah.
once again, you have to be super careful. But how can you take all of those? So you were talking about how you use it for ideation.
Uh huh.
How can you apply that to this kind of fractional CMO work? Obviously, we started out talking about like very high level strategy and putting very detailed customized strategy. You're not going to ask ChatGPT to be your fractional CMO. Like this is not in line with
No.
what it's functioning for.
But you can use it for things like I'll go on and say, what are current trends that are going on
Yes.
in a particular industry or a particular XYZ? And I'll get a list. And I can sit there and say, okay, now let me go cross-reference these with some of the maybe industry publications or industry websites that are going on, and I can validate. But I
Yep.
might not have thought about that if I hadn't done the first step. So
Yeah.
that's kind of how I see it being used and being effective. Now, is it changing? Yes. But it has its place, but it also has to be done with caution that you
Yeah.
just don't believe everything. Do you believe everything you read on the internet? No.
Right.
Same thing with ChatGPT.
Well, and here's another example. So, like, every time I'm recording an episode, I use it to help me think of questions. So, once again, it's sort of this open ended thing that I'm going to obviously step in and adjust the questions, but I have a list over to the side of my screen of just ideas if we start talking about these things. And then I ask it, like, be a little bit surprising. Give me something unique. Give me something that's based on current trends. And it's just like, it just throws it all out there. And I'm like, oh, that's a good one. I hadn't thought about that. So, kind of along the lines of what you're describing. But I'm not asking it to write a script for this show. I'm asking it to give me some angles that I might not have otherwise considered.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and the interesting part of writing a script for this show is you don't know me. And so no matter what it comes up with, unless you fed it lots of information about
Unless I sent
me,
it to you also ahead
yeah,
of time and like, okay, here we go. This is what we're going to say. That would be so weird.
yeah. And those shows are boring. I don't do it anymore. I took a 3-month break. It's now 2 years later, but I ran a podcast for almost 5 years. I remember the very first time, a couple shows I did, I wrote all the questions and I gave it to the guest, and they
Yep.
showed up basically with their complete script.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay,
So
that's
boring.
not going to work. And that was
Yep.
the end of that. So
Yeah.
then when people say, can I have questions? My answer was no. If you
Yeah.
can't answer these questions, you
Yes.
shouldn't be on my show.
Right. Well, also, first of all, like that kind of goes to my skills as a host, but also it's so boring to listen to that stuff. And I've learned the same thing. People will ask me for like a pre-show meeting, and I'm like, no, because we're going to say all the good stuff in that meeting, and then I'm not going to remember it, and I'm going to be jumping all over myself trying to get back to that thing that you said that one time a week ago when we talked. It's just not. Doesn't feel natural, and it doesn't make for a good show. So same thing with AI. Like there's a point when you overdo it and it doesn't feel natural. So, all right. So let's get back over to the budget question, because this is like, it's basically, those are the two big questions. What is that? And then how much does this cost? And I mean, the short answer is it depends. And then there's variations on how different fractional CMOs do this. And one method you mentioned in the beginning is they just sign up for a chunk of hours. The way we do it, because I learned a long time ago not to do hourly work because it punishes people who are fast. And so I don't do hourly work. I do it based more like a project type work. But what we do is we have a big long meeting, we evaluate what that firm needs, and then we talk about how many of those things, we set it up kind of at a year at a time, because most of these things take way longer than most people think. And one of our main goals and my main roles in my perspective is to stay focused. And so we set up quarterly goals, and then things always come up and it's like, no, we can put that on the list. We will do that later. But right now we are doing this, and this is what we talked about. And it's that shiny object syndrome. So that's kind of how we set up our process. It's set up on a year based on sort of quarterly goals. And then we take a look at what all those things are that we're going to accomplish in the year, figure out the cost, and then make it into a nice flat monthly fee. But how do you do that? And what are some other ways?
I talked about hours. Let's not to be misleading, right? Everything is based on need.
Yeah.
We have a conversation. We understand ultimately what their concerns are, what their issues are, what they're trying to accomplish. In a lot of cases, we start with projects because they don't totally understand fractional and do I need a fractional? So we start with some project work. And a lot of times we'll outline all the project work and say, here it is by project by project. Or, for a little bit more, let's say you get me as a fractional, we'll accomplish all the same things. The difference is for me, and I come from the agency world for many years, the difference is if I'm only doing projects, I'm focused on the projects.
And that's
not necessarily consulting and doing the things I might do as a fractional. We add that in. Now you get me as, your senior level marketing person on your team versus me just working on projects. And sometimes that's hard to get, somebody will call me up and say, I need you to do X, Y, and Z. And it's okay, that'll be another project. And they go, well, I just need you to do it. And say, but it's not part of our agreement. And of course, I always get yelled at because I tend to do it anyway. And my partner says, why are you doing that for free?
But I feel like this is kind of how this whole idea was sort of born, is because of what you just described. Like the understanding of hiring a contractor for a specific project and then feeling like that doesn't really cover it. And then I'm going to email them and ask them about XYZ. And then I'm going to get this pushback and I'm going to be kind of irritated because I feel like that project didn't really cover everything I needed. And my biggest example that I talk to a lot of firms about is the website is not a complete marketing strategy. That is a very small sliver of it. And what are you going to do after that website is launched? Have you thought about it? Do you have a plan for that? Because if you don't, this is the difference. So it's not just the website. It's the website plan. It's the launch. It's how do we announce the launch? How do we get that out there? How are we going to promote and bring traffic to the website once we've launched? All of those parts that I just described are not part of a typical website build. And a lot of people think, wait a minute, when they get to the end of a website launch, it's like, wait a minute, now what? And this is where it sort of all started, where it's like, okay, yes, we can help you with that, but that's a different thing. So then now it's like, okay, let me come with a whole comprehensive plan because I get it. I can see what's missing. And so that's the difference from, how we do stuff.
I think that you said something important, and I'm going to reemphasize it, is just building a website doesn't really mean a whole lot if people can't find it. I finished a project last year. We spent all this time doing all this strategic work, but the first out of the chute was now we got to redo all your website work. And so when the website was done, they would say, okay, thank you, basically, thank you very much. And so, whoa, you don't get it. People aren't going to come find this. Matter of fact, the long story short, the project that we work on, the client that we work on was a division that had basically almost non-existent over 20 years. And we're trying to bring it back to life. Just because a website got built doesn't mean people are going to find it.
No.
And so we had to show them, here's all the plans, here's everything you just talked about. And I think people make mistakes. I think once the website's done, they're done. And
it's magic.
It's just the beginning.
Yeah, exactly. It go back to your field of dreams. If you build it, they will come.
Exactly.
No, that is not how marketing works.
I worked with a client in the luxury watch space about a year and a half ago. And when the owner came in, when I met him the first time, he said, who do you think my number one customer is? And I said, well, it's got to be somebody with a lot of discretionary money because I could either buy a car or I could buy a watch, right?
Yeah.
He goes, no, it's Google. It's like, Google. And over the course of the next 8-9 months that I worked with them, I drank the Kool-Aid. I mean, I started writing articles and giving presentations about it because ultimately it's not just showing up in Google, it's showing up on page 1 because people don't go to page, very seldom go to page 2, and they certainly don't go to 3, 4, 5, and 6. So
Yeah.
If you're showing up as number 97 on the list, you're not being seen, right? So
So he
it's,
was sort of saying that he has to play Google's game and
yep,
kind of do the Google dance in order to be found, basically. So he's not
exactly.
actually selling watches to like Google employees. He was
No,
just
no,
like,
no, no.
yeah,
He's
got
using
it. Okay.
Google to be found. Yeah, no,
Yeah, got
absolutely.
it. Okay.
And it's understanding that importance. And I
Yeah.
think that's part of the conversation is it isn't just about building the site. It's about
Yes.
how do you drive traffic there? How do you get people to come there? And that's extremely important if that's going to be
Yeah.
your key area for messaging.
Okay, it is time for the book review. As you know, we have a Thought Leaders Library where all of our guests offer a recommendation for a book that they think you should definitely pay attention to. So, Angela, what is the book you think all these lawyers should have on their shelves?
I thought about this and I certainly have a lot of choices, but the one I don't know if you can even see it here.
Oh,
There we go.
perfect. Oh, yeah,
There
you
it
even
is
have
right
it.
there.
Yes.
It's called The Revenue Growth Habit by Alex Goldfayn, Goldfayn. And the book is really interesting. It's about creating these daily habits to grow your business. His
Oh, I like
position
that.
is the simple art of growing your business by 15% in 15 minutes a day. And so it's really a very structured, here's what you need to do. Here's how you go out and actually ask for a testimonial. Here's
Mm-hmm.
what you do every morning, those kinds of things. And I've used it. I saw him speak about 4 years ago,
Yeah.
and I've actually incorporated for a couple clients his process because it just simplifies it. Because
Oh, I
ultimately,
like that.
you can build the whole structure. I mean, I've got a client that I'm working with, and it's like we're doing it. We're on the tactical side. We're doing social posts and all this kind of stuff, and like I'm
Yeah.
the only one liking and reposting. It's like,
Oh, yeah.
no, your guys in your company, they need to do it, not just me,
Yeah.
right? And to
Right.
get people to understand it isn't just about that you did it, you need to do something with it. But this is a really good book. It's an
Yeah.
easy read, but
That
it's
sounds
very
amazing.
instructional.
I say all the time the two most underrated tactics that I believe in for marketing are patience and consistency. Number one, like, some of these firms have been out there for decades working on their Google ranking, and you can't just come along and like next week overtake them. Like, it's
Yeah.
just not, that's not realistic. So let's have some patience with what is a realistic expectation. And then consistency. This is a genius idea to think about what you can do in a realistic 15 minutes a day. Was it 15 minutes a day or 15 minutes a week?
15 minutes a day.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. And getting out there and just being consistent, because as soon as you fall off, you've seen a million different accounts where all of a sudden you look at the account and they haven't posted in 4 years. And it's like, oh, they must have either gone bankrupt or whatever, but I'm going to move on because I'm assuming they're no longer in business. And that's the worst thing you can do.
Yeah. It's a great point. And you'll talk to somebody, and I'm sure you've been in this situation. They go, oh, yeah, we blog. It's like the last time you blogged was like 2 years ago. That's not
Oh, it's
blogging.
so bad. So that's number one, super red flag when I look at a website. Number two, kind of unrelated, but is your copyright date on the bottom of your footer on the bottom of your site. Just check those two things. If they are outdated, change that today because it's a really bad first impression, and we all see it. It's just like having your fly open or something. It's bad.
It is bad.
All right, Angela, what do you think is one thing that everybody gets wrong about this? And there's a lot because this is sort of a newish concept, but what does everybody get wrong about fractional CMOs?
I think it's partially expectations and not truly understanding what the role is. And for me, working with the client to really kind of outline what we need. I've just presented a proposal, for example, to a prospect. But after a first, literally less than this podcast in time, he was like, okay, give me a proposal. And I said, I don't know anything really about you guys.
Right.
I need to dig in. Right. So, and then it's like, well, we need this, the tactical stuff, and it's like, no,
Yes.
here's what you really need. So I think there's an expectation, but the other side is understanding the role that we play as a strategic leader
Yes.
and not the tactician. And I think that's the biggest. It's ultimately, it always evolves to, so who's going to implement? Are you going to implement this stuff? Well,
Yeah.
no, I
Yeah.
have some people I can use, but no,
Right.
I'm physically not going to do this.
Yeah.
I'm the guy up here creating the vision and helping you paint that roadmap, if you will, but we need it executed. And I think that's probably the other thing. It also, after a while, it starts to morph into that tactical aspect, and they start to see us a little bit differently.
Yeah, I think that's really true. Like taking that step back and thinking of it big picture where, we are going to keep, and I feel like most marketing decisions need that step back too. So when, for example, even when this podcast, I put it on YouTube and I had to take a step back at a certain point and say, what is my point? Why am I on YouTube? And it's really not to go viral. I do not want to do that. I do not want to have millions of hits because that just means a lot of garbage, to be honest. A lot of people that are definitely not my potential clients. And then, having to filter through all of that. So for me, it's really important to have a realistic reason for doing these things and then remind yourself of that. Like when you start to get a lot of traffic or something at that place, it's like, oh, that's nice, but that's not what I'm there for. What I'm there for is, cross links and being able to, have a visual thing and a lot of other branding type strategy reasons. But once again, when I start to look at the traffic and I have to remind myself, okay, no, stop. That's not it. That's not the thing. I don't care about that. Remember, I don't care about that. But it's a really important thing to remind yourself because everybody else, especially in social media, there's a big push for this whole other thing for you to care about. And so if that's not your goal, you probably do need to kind of remind yourself from time to time, like, okay, we're just there to really target this pretty small group. And it's okay if we don't have tens of thousands of likes if it is hitting the right target. So, that's the sort of sub part of that statement is let's make sure it is doing what we want it to do.
Well, especially if you're dealing with a national firm, a
Yeah.
local firm, if you're dealing with a firm here in Orange County, and
Yeah.
that's their trading area, if you will. Well, that
Yep.
kind of puts a fence around things that you might do versus if you're trying to build a brand across the country or in multiple
Right.
states. You can't set it and forget it, right? You have to
Yes.
revisit. It's a plan.
Yep.
It's operational. You have to are you on plan? Are you hitting your goals? Do we need to refresh? And
Yep.
it's a living, breathing entity, if you will, or
And we
any
didn't spend
organization.
I did write down to talk about this, but we kind of ran out of time about the data and the numbers. But it's really important to, when you revisit it, we're not just going on hunches. We're looking at the numbers. What is really working?
Mhm.
And oftentimes you'll be surprised. I am often surprised by like which blog posts do well. And I have this thought, oh, this one's going to do great. No, it's this other one. And you need to go in and actually see the reality of what's happening and then put your efforts towards that based on the numbers and the data, not based on like what you wish it would be.
The market's
Awesome.
telling you what they want.
Exactly. Angelo Ponzi is a fractional CMO, and we will link to the book, obviously, but also all of your links, your LinkedIn and website and your blog posts and all that good stuff on the show page. But thank you so much for being here. I love this conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been fun.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Counsel Cast podcast. Be sure to visit our website at counsel-cast.com for the resources mentioned on the episode and to give us your feedback. If you enjoyed this episode, I would appreciate if you could rate and review the podcast on Apple and subscribe to your favorite podcast platform. See you on the next one.